for the first book report for behavioral finance, I wrote on the book The Darwin Economy. One of the main concepts discussed in this book, as the title suggests, is the role of Darwinian ideas and their impact on the economy. Although typically Adam Smith is considered to be the father of economics with his invisible hand concept and how it is widely regarded as a major indicator of how markets work. Robert H. Frank in this book discusses how and where the invisible hand theory fails, and why Charles Darwin should be considered the great-great-grandfather of free market economics. Following this, Frank goes on to explain various concepts that follow Darwinian theories, and explains how they impact the way we behave and their impact on the free market as a whole. First off, one important principle covered early on is the difference between individual interest and societal interest. Often these two overlap, but this is not definite, which leads to issues in the way society produces goods and services. Darwin, as most people learn in grade school, often known for his extensive research on competition of individuals and species as a whole, and his idea of survival of the fittest and the concept of natural selection. So interestingly, Darwin's analysis revealed a systematic flaw in the dynamics of competition from the very logic of the process itself. Frank highlights various examples of conflicts between individual interests versus societal interests, in which most demonstrate mating habits and relative size, allowing males to win mates. So in many of these cases, the size is passed down to later generations, so those who are of a larger size tend to win mates, which then they pass down their size to later generations, creating a bigger species that would exist than that of if the smaller males were to mate and pass down genes. So counteractively, the larger size then, although it allows them to mate, it is detrimental to the species as a whole, in that it hinders the speed of animals, making it easy to be caught and eaten by predators. So these are examples that show the individual creates a favorable situation for himself in mating, but a less favorable situation for the species as a whole, and that they're more likely to be killed off. This is important to consider when looking at the economy. While the invisible hand concept was an incredible discovery, it fails to take into consideration this exact problem. Later on in the book, the author, Frank, goes on to highlight a series of studies in which participants were asked to imagine a choice between two identical situations in all respects except for one explicit difference. Similar to the first example of individual versus societal benefit, two studies are proposed giving participants a choice between a situation in which they have absolute advantage and one in which they have relative advantage. The first has to do with house size, and the second has to do with chances of dying while performing jobs, so relative to the safety of the job. Interestingly enough, it was found that when it came to house size, many individuals would prefer to have a relative advantage as opposed to an absolute advantage, going against Smith's invisible hand theory, but they preferred to have an absolute advantage in safety on the job instead of a higher risk of death than a relative advantage. This seems illogical to most, especially anyone loyal to Smith's principles, because why would someone give up an absolute advantage if they're faced with a relative disadvantage to others in society? It seems irrational, but most find that for specific goods, a slight relative advantage outweighs a slight decline in absolute advantage. Following Fred Hirsch's terminology, the housing and workplace safety situations can be described as positional and non-positional, respectively. As the name suggests, these lend themselves to desires for relative versus absolute advantage. Following this, consumers are more likely to spend a relatively larger amount of money for a positional good than on a non-positional good, which leads to a slight shift in demand for certain goods throughout the economy. Next, Frank discusses negative externalities when considering a situation in which a woman, Sarah, wants to play loud music late at night while her neighbor, Sam, desires silence. In the same passage, Frank ties in the necessity of the cost-benefit principle. Quite obviously, this is a fundamental concept in any rational economic model, in which any decision should be made based on whether or not the additional benefit outweighs the added cost. In this example, it is supposed that there are two options: creating a noise curfew of 10 o'clock p.m. or a noise curfew of 11 o'clock p.m., which will satisfy Sam and Sarah respectively. In order to come to a decision, legislators will need to decide who benefits more by having their way. This is difficult to distinguish because there's debate over how one would measure this. One proposed measurement asserts that if each places a monetary value on their desired time, the person willing to pay more will do so because of the added benefit, which will create the greatest good in the economy. Although an enticing method, their willingness to pay to get their way is dependent on their ability to pay. If Sarah is willing to pay less than Sam, but has far less income, then this is clearly not a valid indicator of the benefit that her getting her way will provide to her. That said, is this the best way to measure overall benefit in the economy? It is clearly not ultimately fair, but are there better alternatives? Frank next cites a case in which there are two people, Susan and Malcolm, who are looking to purchase an antique grandfather clock. After describing Susan and Malcolm, it is clear that Susan will surely enjoy and get more use out of the clock, but Malcolm is willing to pay more. Given this, willingness to pay would not indicate overall benefit. But if we take at face value what the two say about how much they'd be willing to pay for the clock, it really would not be better for her to own it. The reason is that she also has more urgent uses than Malcolm for virtually everything else that money might buy. Lastly, I would like to highlight some of Frank's statements on taxation and common slogans that are used in the tax debate. In the tax policy class that I'm taking, this is something we've widely discussed, which is likely why I was so intrigued by it. Frank lists various slogans that he believes to be mindless and rather ignorant. Some of these have to do with taxes as a whole, while others discuss tax progressivity and economic fairness. Although it's difficult, essentially impossible, to create a system, even though a hypothetical one in which everyone is satisfied and views it favorably, is interesting to take a look at what people believe to be true and how often uninformed they are. Frank uses these common slogans and ideas about the tax system to disprove several theories. In Chapter 11, he goes on to list various changes that could be made to the system that would benefit society as a whole. Going back to the cost-benefit principle, taxes on any activity not only generates revenue, but also discourages the activity. Frank then discusses how society tax harmful activities such as SO2 and CO2 emissions. This could create a benefit to society in that it would discourage the emission of such harmful gases while also generating revenue for the government. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book, would certainly recommend it to anyone to read, even if they're not particularly interested in behavioral finance or economics in general, just simply based on the theories and concepts. I think Frank discusses various issues throughout the economy and a myriad of situations that describe complex problems in easy to understand scenarios. I would certainly read more of Frank's work after finishing this book and hope to do so in the near future. Thank you.